You're standing in a field counting. Not silver, not enemies, cattle. It is October, the year 980, somewhere in the north of Iceland, and the light is already dying earlier every day. The grass under your boots has gone stiff and pale. The wind off the water carries the first real edge of the cold that is coming, and it is not going away again for a very long time. In front of you stand your cows, your sheep, your few thin horses, their breath hanging in the air. Behind you, stacked and lashed down against the wind, is your hay. Everything you cut and dried and saved across the brief weeks of summer, and in your head you are doing the only arithmetic that matters in this place. How many animals, how much hay, how many months of dark. Because the cold is not the thing most likely to kill you. The math is. There is no town within reach, no market that will open in the morning, no lord with a granary, no road to walk to somewhere warmer, no one coming to help. The nearest farm is a smudge of smoke across an empty valley, and they are counting too. Winter here does not last 3 months. It lasts 9. And if your count is wrong, if you have kept one more animal than your hay can carry, you will not find out in October. You will find out in February, in the black middle of it, when the hay runs low and the dark still has weeks left to give, and there is nothing left to do but watch something starve. Forget the picture you have been given. Forget the idea of a warm green age, a gentle medieval climate, settlers stepping off their ships into easy pasture. That story belongs to somewhere else. You have heard maybe that these centuries were a warm time. The medieval warm period, they call it, a stretch of mild years across the North Atlantic when farms spread and harvests grew. And in some places that was true, but that warmth was patchy. It was local. It did not arrive evenly across the world like a blanket, and where you're standing on the rim of the habitable earth at 64 degrees north, it barely arrived at all. We can read the truth out of the ground itself. In the lake beds of northern Iceland, in the sediment laid down layer on layer for 1,000 years, the record shows glaciers that were not retreating in any gentle warmth. They were advancing and pulling back, grinding at the edges of where a human being could live. The ice was on the move the whole time. The warm age was, for you, a story told about other people's weather. And the land beneath you is not stable. It is alive in the worst way. This island sits on a wound in the earth, and it bleeds fire. 2 centuries before you were born, the winter of 763 turned so catastrophically cold that the Black Sea itself froze over, and sea ice drifted down to the walls of Constantinople thousands of miles away. No one can say for certain which mountain, in which land, dimmed the sun that year, but a cold that savage is exactly the kind of blow a volcano can deal when it hurls enough ash and sulphur into the sky, and the ice cores of Greenland, layered with the sulphur of eruptions across these centuries, show that the mountains of the north were anything but quiet. People once imagined a long volcanic slumber here. The evidence buried in the ice says otherwise. The mountains do not sleep. They wait. This is the world your grandparents chose. Understand that. No one was driven here at the point of a sword. Men and women loaded their families and their animals onto open ships and crossed the worst water in the known world to reach a place where the soil is thin. The trees vanish within a lifetime. The sun disappears for half the year, and the ground itself can open and burn. They came for land of their own, for freedom from kings, and the price of that freedom was this. So when the old stories, the sagas your descendants will write down 200 and 300 years from now, speak of the winters here, They do not lie about them. They remember seasons of plenty, yes, and they remember winters so savage that whole districts went hungry, winters that emptied farms and broke families. We hold those stories loosely because they were set down long after the fact, from memory passed mouth to mouth. But on this one point they and the buried evidence agree completely. This was not a kind place. It was never going to be. And there is one more thing that makes it harder than anywhere your cousins live in Norway or the British Isles. There people cluster, villages, hamlets, neighbours within shouting distance, walls that share walls. Here you are alone. The Icelandic farm stands by itself, set deliberately apart from the next, a single household marooned in its own valley. There is strength in that independence. There is also a terrible exposure. When the snow closes the passes and the dark comes down, your farm is its own small world, and whatever happens inside it happens with no one watching and no one near enough to save you. So before the first snow falls, you had better know exactly what this winter is going to demand. And it begins, before anything else, with a count. Survival here does not begin with a fire. It begins with arithmetic, done standing in a cold field with the light failing, and it is the most important calculation you will ever make. Here is the equation that rules your life. A single cow, one animal, needs more than 2 metric tons of dried hay to live through the 9 months of an Icelandic winter. 2 tons. And to grow that much hay, you must clear and tend roughly 4 acres of hayfield. For 1 cow. Multiply that across a herd, and you begin to see the shape of the trap. Every animal you own is a debt against the grass, and the grass only grows for a few short weeks under a low summer sun. So in the autumn, the head of the household walks the fields and the stores and does the sum. Hay on one side, mouths on the other, and whatever the hay cannot carry through to spring does not see the spring. It is slaughtered now in the cold weeks of autumn, its blood saved, its meat cut and dried and soured and packed away into the winter stores. This is not a tragedy. It is a tool. The animals you cannot feed become the food that feeds you. Sentiment is a luxury this island does not stock. And the count is not simple, because not every animal is worth the same to you. The cattle are the aristocracy of your herd. They are wealth itself, the measure of a man's standing, and they are the source of the thing that will keep your family alive through the dark. Milk and everything you can make from it. So the cows go inside, into the warm heart of the farm, fed and sheltered and protected. They are too valuable in every sense to risk. The sheep are another matter, and here the calculation turns hard. Your sheep are small, barely 60 centimetres at the shoulder, 35 kilos of bone and coarse wool, but they are tough beyond reason, bred and shaped by this island into animals that can survive what would kill a softer breed, and so you use that toughness without mercy. The castrated rams, the wethers, are prized for their heavy fleece, and because their value is wool and not milk, they do not earn a place by the fire. They are left out, all winter, turned loose to scratch through the snow and the ice for whatever dead grass and frozen brushwood they can find, surviving on the margins because they were built to. Only the breeding ewes, heavy with the lambs that next year's flock, are penned and sheltered, brought into low stone enclosures, or hauled inside the main house itself when a blizzard threatens to bury them where they stand. The pigs are kept close to the homestead, home-field pigs near at hand. They throw off a little warmth, but that is not why you keep them. You keep them because they breed fast and feed themselves, rooting for their own food, and because a suckling pig is a delicacy, a mark of status, something to slaughter young for a winter feast when the dark needs breaking, and the horses. The horses are bred carefully on this island, and not only for what you would expect. Yes, a horse carries you across the broken country between farms. Yes, it is how news and help travel in a land with no roads. But a horse is also food, cheap food, on the hoof, that can be killed and eaten when the winter turns desperate. And more than that, in this year, in 980, this island is still a pagan place, only a generation away from the great conversion that is coming. Horse meat is not just a meal here. It is sacred. It is eaten at the feast where blood is offered to the old gods, a ritual that the new religion will soon try to stamp out entirely. To eat a horse in 980 is an act of faith as much as an act of hunger. Watching over all of it, moving at the edge of the count, are the dogs. Small, sharp, sturdy animals, the ancestors of the herding dogs that still work these hills. They are not pets. They earn their keep. They warn the house of a stranger on the path. They track a man fleeing through snow when a blood feud turns to the hunt. And in the autumn, before the count, they do the work that makes the count possible at all. The great collaborative roundups when the half-wild sheep are driven down out of the high summer pastures, dog and man together, gathering the scattered flock back to the farms before the snow seals the highlands shut. So you stand in the field and you count, and around the count there is one more rule, written into the law of the land that you cannot break. You cannot simply pick up and leave. You cannot drift to a richer farm or a kinder valley if the math comes out against you. By law, every person on this island must belong to a farm, a fixed place, a named household. Wandering is not freedom here. It is a crime, and very nearly a death sentence. And the only time in the entire year you are permitted to change where you belong, to take a new contract, move to a new household, start somewhere else, is a narrow 4-day window at the end of May. 4 days. Choose wrong or arrive too late, and you are locked to your place and your count for another full turn of the year, all the way around through the dark and out the other side. So the count is everything. Get it right and you have a chance. But the hay and the meat you have so carefully tallied are worth nothing at all if you have nowhere to keep them from freezing, and nowhere to keep yourself. And against this winter, the first thing you build is not a fire. It is a wall of earth. Stand where you mean to build, and look at the land the way your life depends on it, because it does. You do not build in the low ground. Never the hollow, never the flat by the water's edge, however convenient it looks. Low ground holds water, and water in an Icelandic winter freezes, and a frozen, waterlogged foundation will pull the cold straight up into your house and turn the floor to ice beneath your sleeping family. So you build up. On a ridge, a slope. A shoulder of dry rising ground where the wet drains away and the earth beneath your home stays sound. You build near running water, and you choose it carefully over a dug well. This seems backward until you understand the cold. Still water, trapped in a shallow well, freezes hard and freezes through. But a stream, a river, water that moves, it resists the freeze far longer, fighting the ice with its own motion, keeping a thread of liquid open into the depths of winter when a well would be a plug of solid ice. And you will need that water every single day, not just for yourselves but for the great thirsty herd you're about to shelter. And you build where you can see. This is a land with no king's army, no garrison, no one to call. The only defence your farm has is warning. The time to react, to arm, to light a signal. So the farm sits high, with a long line of sight across the valley, and on the cliff above it you raise a cairn of stones, a marker where a fire can be lit fast and bright to scream for help across the miles of emptiness when a raid comes or a disaster. At one such farm, the archaeologists found exactly that, a stone cairn set high on the ridge above the house, a place to light the fire that called the neighbours in. Now you build. And here you run straight into the great problem of this island, the one that shapes almost everything. There is no wood. There was once. When the first ships came, perhaps a century before your birth, much of Iceland was wrapped in birch woodland. But people came, and people burn, and people clear land for hay, and turn animals loose to graze. And within a generation or two the woods were collapsing, stripped and burned and eaten back far faster than this cold, thin soil could ever regrow them. By your lifetime in 980, the forest is a shadow of what it was, and real timber is a luxury. Real structural wood is hoarded, reserved for the load-bearing frame, the roof rafters, the posts that hold the whole thing up, and in the houses of the rich, a little panelling to show that they can afford it. For everything else, for the very walls of your home, you turn to the only building material this island has in endless supply. You turn to the ground itself. You go to the bog and you cut turf, not random sods, but wedge-shaped blocks cut to a craft, each one carrying its own precise weight of soil and living root woven together. The roots are the secret. They hold the block together, bind it, give it a structural strength that bare dirt could never have, and you stack these blocks, grass side down, in a tight interlocking herringbone pattern, course on course, until the walls rise. And these are not thin walls. They climb to 2 meters thick, 2 meters of earth and root between you and the wind. What you have built, without a single word of physics to explain it, is one of the most elegant pieces of survival engineering of the entire medieval world. Because that massive earthen wall is not just a barrier, it is a battery for heat. Here is how it works, in the only terms that matter, the terms your freezing body understands. Turf is a superb insulator. The wind cannot get through 2 meters of packed root and soil. But more than that, all that mass can store warmth. Through the few hours of daylight and through the evening when the central fire is built up high, the enormous bulk of those walls drinks in heat and holds it. And then through the long, killing hours of the night, as the temperature outside crashes far below freezing, and in the worst cold snaps far below that still, the walls give it back, slowly, steadily, breathing the stored warmth back into the room long after the fires died to embers. The house levels out the savagery of the climate. It catches the warmth and doles it out across the dark. The Romans did the same thing with hot air under their floors. The Persians did it with great domes of earth to make ice in the desert. You do it with bog and roots and the labour of your own back, and it works. The one enemy of this house is damp, because damp rots the precious wooden frame from within, and a rotted frame is a collapsed roof, a dead family under the snow. So you fight it with fire and patience. You scorch the wooden post black before you set them, charring the outer surface hard, because charred wood resists the rot far longer than raw. A primitive trick, a life-saving one. And the inside of this house tells the story of who you are. Walk into the oldest farms, the ones from the first settlement years. One was dug up from beneath the streets of Reykjavik itself, and you find a single long room, undivided, with the animal stalls built right into the living space, directly across from the front door. Human and beast in one room, sharing one air, sharing one warmth. That is the old way, carried over from Norway. But as the years pass and some families grow rich, the houses grow complicated. In the grandest farms, the byre is walled off into its own chamber, though never sealed away, always kept connected to the hall, because that connection is the whole point. We know exactly how far this evolution ran, because one of these wealthy farmsteads was preserved for us in the most Icelandic way imaginable. It was buried, whole, by a volcanic eruption, and dug out again centuries later almost intact. It was a fully partitioned house, the living quarters set apart from the animals, with indoor stalls for 18 head of cattle, every room laid out with the sophistication that puts the lie to any idea of these people as crude. They were not building huts. They were building the most advanced cold-weather dwellings their world could produce, refined across generations of bitter winters, and then the same fire that made the island habitable reached up and swallowed one of them whole, sealing it like a message to anyone who came after. The mountains gave, and the mountains took, and in the taking they kept a perfect record of what had been built. And the wealthiest, most fearful households built in things stranger still. One saga remembers a chieftain who built his bed-closet with a hidden trapdoor in the floor, dropping into a tunnel that ran clear out of the house and into the sheep barn. A secret escape for the night the blood feud finally came for him in his sleep. We cannot prove that particular tunnel ever existed. The saga was written long after. But the fear behind it was real enough, and so was the world that made a man build his own bolt hole beneath his bed. So now you have it. A house of earth sited to drain and to see, walled 2 meters thick, storing the warmth of the day against the cruelty of the night. But a wall can only hold heat. It cannot make it. And to make heat in a land with almost no wood to burn, you need a furnace that never goes out, never needs feeding from a woodpile that doesn't exist, and never freezes solid in the night. In the year 980 that furnace is alive. It breathes, and it is standing in the next room. Walk into the byre on a winter night, and the first thing that hits you is the warmth. Not the sharp warmth of a fire, but a deep, damp animal heat, rising off the broad backs of the cattle in the dark. You have been thinking of these cows as food, as wealth, as milk. Tonight think of them as machines, because that is what they are. Each one of them is a furnace, and it never stops burning. It happens inside the animal, in the great fermenting vat of its gut, the 4-chambered stomach where billions of microbes break down the tough cellulose of the winter hay. That breakdown is a chemical fire, slow and constant, and like any fire it throws off heat. By modern reckoning, a cow standing in a stall radiates heat on the order of 1,000 watts, and a large well-fed one a good deal more, ceaselessly, hour after hour, day and night. Awake, asleep, it makes no difference. The furnace runs on, and you do not have just one. The first settlers understood this in their bones, even without the numbers. That is why the oldest houses put the animals inside the living space, not because they could not build a separate barn, but because the animals were the heating. Later, when families could afford the luxury of a wall between themselves and the dung and the noise, they built one. But they left the byre joined to the hall deliberately, so the heat could still flow through. They were not being sentimental about their cows. They were being precise. Look at the real farms the archaeologists have uncovered, and the scale of it comes clear. That same partitioned farmstead, the one the volcano kept whole for us, held stalls for 18 head of cattle inside the structure. The great high-status estates, the kind named in the sagas, held as many as 30. Stop and do the math on 18 cows. 18 animals, each pouring out heat without pause, Add up to a heating system of many kilowatts running in your house around the clock all winter long, the equal of a serious modern furnace that never once switches off and never burns a stick of the wood you do not have. And consider what kind of heating system it is. It needs no spark to light it. It has no flame to be smothered or blown out. It has no fuel line to freeze in the night, no woodpile to run down, no supply chain reaching out to anywhere you cannot see. It runs on hay, and the hay grew in the field within sight of your front door, cut and dried by your own hands in the summer. It is a closed loop, sealed and self-contained. Grass becomes hay, hay becomes heat, and the heat keeps the family alive through a dark the wood could never have carried them through. The warmth drifts down the length of the hall on the slow tide of the animal's breathing, and the convection of it pulls the heat through the whole low room, so that even when the world outside has dropped to a temperature that would kill an exposed man in an hour, the inside of the house stays survivable. It is one of the most ingenious things human beings have ever done with the problem of cold. With no engineering, no machinery, no fuel they had to mine or fell, the Norse turned the metabolism of a living animal into a central heating system, and built their entire winter survival on top of it. It is brilliant. It is self-sustaining. It asks nothing of you that the cattle do not already do for free, and it is slowly, quietly, killing everyone who sleeps inside it. There is no glass in the windows of this house, because there are no windows. There is no chimney. That invention has not reached you and will not for centuries. There is one hole, cut in the roof, with a flap to open and close it. That hole is the only deliberate ventilation in the entire structure, and against it works a fire that must never be allowed to die. The hearth sits in the middle of the floor, long and open, and it does everything for you. It is your heat on top of the warmth of the animals. It is your light in a place where the sun is gone for most of the day. It is your kitchen, the only place to cook. You cannot live without it, and every hour it burns, it fills the sealed room with smoke. We do not have to guess how bad it was. Archaeologists have built working copies of these houses, real turf walls, real earth floors, real open fires, and then put instruments inside to measure the air. The results are grim beyond what anyone expected. The fine particles of smoke, the tiny ones that go deepest into the lungs, settled at an average of more than 100 times the level that modern health authorities consider safe to breathe across a single day. 100 times, and that was the average. The peaks when the fire was built up or the wind sealed the smoke hole ran far higher still. Carbon monoxide, the invisible odourless gas that quietly stops your blood from carrying oxygen, hung steadily in the air, heaviest near the fire, thinning toward the edges but present everywhere in the room, and the smoke does not fill the room evenly. It layers. Heat carries it upward, so the worst of it gathers in a dense stinging cloud across the upper half of the house, while the air lower down stays just barely breathable. This single fact shaped how an entire civilization lived indoors. You cannot stand up straight in your own home for long. To stand is to put your head into the poison, so you live low, you sit, you crouch. You work and eat and sleep on the raised platforms built along the walls, down beneath the smoke, in the thin layer of survivable air near the floor. The posture of the Viking home, everyone down low, gathered close to the ground, is not custom or comfort. It is a body's instinct to stay beneath a killing cloud, and the cloud does not fall on everyone equally. It falls hardest on whoever spends the most hours inside it. The men of the household go out, to the herds, the fields, the fishing, the gathering, the politics of the assembly. but the work that keeps the household alive from the inside is done by the women, at the loom, and the cooking fire and the dairy, in the smoke, hour after hour, day after day, all winter, and beside them the ones too small or too old to leave, the infants in their arms, the elders by the fire. They breathe the most of it for the longest, across whole lifetimes. You can read the cost in their bones. The skeletons recovered from this age carry the unmistakable marks of chronic lung disease, the scarring and damage of airways breathed raw, year after year, by smoke. The thing that kept them from freezing is the same thing that shortened their breath and their lives. That was the bargain, and there was no better one available. The house was a machine for surviving the cold, and it was also a slow poison, and you could not have one without the other. So this is your situation as the real winter closes in. You have heat you cannot fully breathe, in a house you cannot fully leave, for months without end. Which makes the next question the one that now governs everything. Across 9 months in which not one blade of edible grass will grow, in which the ground is iron and the sea is half the time too wild to fish, what exactly are you going to eat? Settle into the rhythm of a winter day, because there is not much to it, and that sparseness is itself a strategy. You eat twice, not 3 times, not whenever hunger strikes, twice. A meal near midday and a meal at the end of the working hours, when what little light there was has gone. 2 meals, measured and deliberate, because the food has to last through a winter that does not end, and a household that grazes through its stores in the early dark is a household that starves in the late dark. You eat from bowls of carved wood. You drink from tankards built of wooden staves. There is no pottery to spare for such things, and metal is precious. Wood is what the hands of the household can make in the long evenings. Cooking in this house is its own quiet engineering problem, because of what you do not have. You have a few iron tools, a roasting spit perhaps for the rare turning of meat over the fire. You have vessels carved from soapstone, that soft warm rock that takes heat without cracking. But many of your containers are made of wood, or leather, or clay, and you cannot set wood or leather over an open flame without destroying them. So how do you boil water in a bucket you cannot put on the fire? You heat the fire instead of the pot. You take stones, chosen stones, ones that will not shatter, and you bury them in the heart of the hearth until they are glowing. Then, with tongs, you lift them out and drop them straight into the liquid in the wooden vessel. The stone gives up its stored heat in a furious hiss of steam, and the water boils around it. Pot boilers, we call them. Drop in another, and you can keep a stew or a broth rolling without ever exposing the vessel to flame. It is the same principle as the heat-storing walls and the heat-storing animals. Store the warmth in mass, release it where you need it, applied now to the cooking of a single meal, and the grain, when you have it, is ground at home, by hand, on a heavy rotary quern. 2 thick discs of stone, the upper one turned and turned against the lower, the grain fed in by hand and crushed to a coarse meal between them. It is slow, hard, repetitive labour, and it falls to the lowest hands in the household. The flour it makes is precious, because the grain itself is precious. In the milder years, a little barley and oats can be coaxed from this soil, but as the cold deepens, you depend more and more on grain carried in by ship from elsewhere, expensive and rationed, eaten sparingly as a thin gruel or a porridge, or saved and fermented into the beer that marks a feast day apart from an ordinary one. It was not all grey, though. The summer, brief as it was, left its mark on the winter table. In the warm weeks you tended small gardens, cress, a little cumin, mustard, and you ranged out across the land to gather what grew wild and could be dried and kept. Bog myrtle, wild thyme, yarrow, angelica, juniper. These were not decoration. They were how you made the heavily preserved winter food bearable. Herbs to flavour the soured meat and the dried fish, to mask the sharpness of food that had been kept alive by methods that did not leave it tasting fresh. And for sweetness, there was one thing only, and it was rare and treasured. Honey. Honey to sweeten a special dish. Honey to brew into mead for the great occasions. Sugar did not exist in your world. This single sweet thing in it came from bees, and you guarded every drop. So the day has its shape. The fire, the 2 meals, the grinding and the boiling, the smell of dried herbs cutting through the smoke. But all of it rests on a deeper foundation, on the fact that the food on those wooden plates was caught or grown months ago, in the light, and somehow kept from rotting all the way into the dark. And the methods the Norse used to do that were so sophisticated, so precisely tuned to the chemistry of decay, that they are still being used in your kitchen 1,000 years later. How do you keep a whole year's food alive through a whole year's winter, on an island with almost no salt? You learn to control rot itself. This is the heart of it. This is the single problem on which everything else depends, because a warm house full of people with nothing to eat is just a slower grave. Every mouthful you will swallow between now and spring had to be taken in the months of light, and somehow held against decay through the months of dark. And the obvious way to do that, the way the rest of the medieval world did it, is mostly closed to you. The rest of the world preserved with salt. Salt draws the water out of meat and fish, and without water the rot cannot take hold. But salt here is almost impossible to get. There is no fierce sun to evaporate seawater in great pans the way they do in warmer lands. And to boil seawater down to salt takes enormous quantities of fuel, and the fuel, the wood, is gone. A little salt comes in by ship, traded at a price, and it is hoarded like silver. You cannot preserve a winter's worth of food in salt you do not have. So the Norse did something cleverer. They did not fight the microbes that cause rot. They recruited a different set of microbes to fight on their side. They mastered, by trial and tradition and inheritance, the chemistry of fermentation, and built their entire winter food supply on it. Start with the milk, because milk is the foundation. Through the summer, while the cows give richly, the women skim the cream from the top and churn it to butter. But butter, unsalted, will turn rancid before winter is half over, so they do not leave it sweet. They let the right bacteria work it, culturing it, souring it just enough that the acid the microbes produce holds off the spoilage. Cultured butter keeps where sweet butter would rot. The souring is the preservation. Then comes the thing at the very centre of the Icelandic winter diet, the food this island still eats today, skyr. You take the skimmed milk, the part left after the cream is gone, still rich in protein, and you transform it. You add rennet, drawn from the stomach of a calf, and you add a starter, a living culture of specific bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria that have made this exact food for generations. They go to work on the milk and turn it, over hours, into something dense and thick and sharp and intensely nourishing. A soft, soured, protein-packed cheese that you can pack into great wooden vats and keep for months. Skyr is not a treat. It is survival in a bowl. The concentrated goodness of the whole summer's milk held alive deep into the dark. And here is the detail that tells you what this food meant. The cultures were not bought or remade each year. They were living things, inherited, passed down a family like an heirloom. By long custom, when a daughter married and left to build her own household, her mother would give her a spoonful of the living Skyer culture to carry with her. The specific strain of bacteria her family had kept alive for who knows how many generations, now seeding the new home's vats. A microbial bloodline handed mother to daughter so that the new household's food would carry the old household's life inside it. They could not have told you what a bacterium was, but they knew exactly that the magic lived in that spoonful and that it had to be kept unbroken. Now follow the chemistry one step further, because the Norse wasted nothing. When the skyr sets, a watery liquid separates and rises to the top of the vat, the whey, and that whey is not garbage. First, it does a job right there. It forms a layer over the cheese below, sealing it from the air, an anaerobic cap that keeps the mould and the spoilage out so the Skyer can cure undisturbed for months. The byproduct preserves the product, but leave that whey alone, let it keep fermenting on its own, and it changes again. It grows sharper and sharper, turning into a fiercely acidic liquid, sour with lactic acid. And now the Norse have a weapon. They take this acid and they drop their meat into it, sausages, offal, the parts of the slaughtered autumn animals that would rot fastest. Submerged in that acid, the meat's own chemistry changes. The acid drives down its internal pH until it becomes a place where the bacteria of rot simply cannot live, where the dangerous pathogens are neutralized and the putrefaction stopped cold. Sour food, they call the whole category of it, meat preserved not by salt, not by smoke alone, but by drowning it in fermented whey until decay becomes chemically impossible. Stop and understand what this is. This is microbiology, practiced fluently, 1,000 years before anyone would see a microbe or name what was happening. With no theory at all, by pure inherited craft, the Norse engineered an entire preservation system out of controlled bacterial fermentation, souring the butter, culturing the cheese, sealing the vats with whey, and pickling the winter's meat in acid. And they did it all without the salt that the rest of the world thought was essential. It kept them alive, and the same soured cheese, carried by the same kind of living culture, is sitting in supermarket coolers across the world right now. But milk and meat were not the whole of it. There was another larder vaster than any field, and it ringed the entire island. There was the sea. When the land gives nothing, the water still can. And the Norse who settled this island leaned on the sea as hard as they leaned on the cow. The trick, as always, was not the catching, it was the keeping. Begin with the fish, and above all with cod. Through the summer and the autumn, when the boats can go out, the cod come in by the thousands. And then begins the work that turns a perishable catch into a winter food that will outlast the winter many times over. The fish are split and gutted and hung, not over smoke, not packed in salt you do not have, but simply hung on great wooden racks out in the open, in the relentless freezing wind that scours this coast. The wind does the work. It dries the fish slowly and completely, pulling the water out of the flesh until what remains is hard as a board, dense, almost weightless, and nearly imperishable. Stockfish, it is called. Properly made, it keeps not for months but for years. A rack of wind-dried cod is a bank account against starvation, hung up to cure in the one resource Iceland has in brutal abundance, cold moving air. Then there is the hunting of the great animals of the sea, and the unparalleled prize they offered, fat. In the first years of settlement the coast teemed with walrus, and the settlers fell on them hard for their meat, for their thick fat, and for the ivory of their tusks, which was worth a fortune in the markets across the water. They hunted them so hard that within a few generations the walrus had vanished from these shores, by the evidence now coming out of the ground and the genetics of their bones, hunted out, locally extinct. A resource consumed to almost nothing nearly as fast as it was found. It is one of the first chapters in a very old human story, written here in blood and ivory on the Icelandic beaches. But the seals remained, and the seals were a gift that arrived exactly when it was needed most. In the cold winters, the worst winters, the ones the household feared, the pack ice drifts down from the north and rides right up against the Icelandic coast, and the seals ride down with it, hauling out on the ice within reach of the hunters. And so in the very season of greatest need, the sea delivers seals to the doorstep. They are taken without mercy because of what they carry: blubber, fat. And fat in this place is not a flavour or a luxury. It is the literal fuel your body burns to hold its core temperature against a cold that is always trying to pull the heat out of you. A human being working and living in this climate needs enormous reserves of fat simply to stay warm from the inside, and there is no butter to spare and no oil from any plant. The rendered fat of the seal fills that gap, fried with, eaten on its own, swallowed for the raw caloric heat of it. Seal blubber is a wall of warmth built on the inside of the body, and in a hard winter it is the difference between a family that holds its heat and a family that fades. And around the edges of all this, the smaller harvests of the coast, smaller, but never beneath notice, because nothing on this island was beneath notice. The cliffs that ring the coast are not empty rock. In their season they are thick with seabirds, nesting in their tens of thousands on every ledge and crevice. And the Norse went up after them. The puffins were taken in their season, for the meat and the fat. And in the brief weeks of spring and early summer, when the ledges were full, the eggs were gathered, and gathering them meant going over the edge, lowered on ropes, or scrambling along narrow shelves of crumbling rock hundreds of feet above the surf, reaching into the nests for the eggs while the sea boiled white below, and the wind tried to peel you off the cliff face. It was lethal work, and people died at it, and they did it anyway, year after year, because every egg was protein and every bird was fat. And on this island, protein and fat were the raw material of survival itself. There was no source too small to count, no harvest too dangerous to attempt, when the alternative was the slow arithmetic of a winter that came up short. A cliff full of eggs was not a treat. It was a granary you climbed into at the risk of your life. Every source counted. Nothing, not a fish, not a seal, not a bird, not an egg on a ledge over the open sea, was ever left untaken. So the stores are filling, the vats of soured skier sealed under their caps of whey. The meat drowned in acid, safe in its barrels, the hard boards of wind-dried cod, the rendered seal fat, layer on layer of food, each kept alive by a different trick wrung out of a hostile world. You are for now fed, you are housed, you're warm enough to choke on it. You are fed against the dark, but all of that keeps you alive only inside the house. And you cannot stay inside the house. Every single day, someone must go out, to break the ice on the water, to throw fodder to the weathers freezing in the open, to haul the peat, to do the 100 outdoor tasks the farm demands even in the dead of winter. And the moment you step through that door into the wind, a new enemy is waiting, one that does not bother with months or weeks, one that can get through to your skin and kill you in a matter of minutes. So how do you dress a human body to survive that? You build it a second house, one it can wear. The cold does not kill you through the air around you, it kills you through your skin, by stealing the heat your body makes faster than your body can replace it. So the clothing you wear is not decoration, and it is not even comfort. It is a portable microclimate, a second shelter wrapped around your body, engineered with the same seriousness you brought to the walls of the house, and the material it is built from is the same one that built half your world, wool. The cloth itself has a name, vadmal, and it is the bedrock of everything. It is a dense, tightly woven homespun woolen cloth, and the women of the household make it from nothing, through one of the most labour-devouring processes in the entire economy, shearing the sheep, washing the greasy fleece, combing it straight, spinning it into thread on a handheld spindle weighted with a whirl of stone, and finally weaving it, thread by thread, on a tall upright loom where the warp threads hang under the pull of heavy stone weights. Hours upon hours upon hours of work go into a single length of it, and the result was so valuable, so durable, so absolutely central to survival that it became money, literally money. Across this island, debts and prices and fines were reckoned and paid in measured lengths of vadmal, counted out in exact units, traded in place of silver. The cloth on your back was the currency in your purse. To weave was to mint. You wear it in a system, and the system is clever, because it exploits the different properties of different fibres with real precision. Against the skin, when you can afford it, goes linen, cool, smooth, comfortable. But flax barely grows on this island, so linen is rare and dear, a sign of some wealth. Over the linen goes the wool, and here is where the engineering shows, because the Norse understood the one miracle property of wool that mattered most in a wet, freezing land. Wool holds its warmth even when it is soaked. Cotton or linen, wet, will pull the heat out of you and kill you. Wool, wet, still insulates. In a place where you cannot keep dry, that single fact is the difference between life and death, and the whole wardrobe is built around it. The men wear a fitted tunic and trousers of tightly woven wool, cut and tailored with real skill. The women wear a long woolen overdress, an apron-like garment hung from the shoulders by straps and pinned at the front with a pair of oval brooches, the brooches that turn up in grave after grave, the signature of a Norse woman's dress. On the legs go long strips of wool, wound tightly round and round from the knee down to the ankle, sealing the lower leg against the wet snow and trapping the body's heat against the shin. And over all of it goes the cloak, and the cloak is pinned not at the throat but offset over the left shoulder deliberately, so that the right arm, the sword arm, stays free and unhindered. Even the way you fasten your coat is shaped by a world where the weapon hand must never be tangled, and for the very worst of it, the open hillside in a blizzard, the night crossing, the hours of exposure that ordinary cloth cannot answer, the Norse engineered something special, a shaggy cloak, thick with raw, unspun locks of wool knotted directly into the weave as it was made, hundreds of them. So the finished cloak hangs heavy with a deep pelt of fleece. It mimics an animal's coat exactly, and it works for exactly the same reason an animal's coat works. It traps a thick, still layer of dead air against the body, and still air is the finest insulation there is. A man wrapped in one of these is wearing a sheep's own defence against this climate, rebuilt by human hands. Even the tailoring carried hard-won intelligence. The trousers of the Norse world were cut to a pattern refined over centuries, not the 4 simple panels you might expect, but 2 large panels wrapping each leg, joined by a clever-shaped piece at the crotch and a panel at the back, a geometry that did several things at once. It placed the seams to the sides rather than straight through the groin, so they did not chafe when a man sat through a long winter evening. It ran the inner seam off the tender inner thigh and around toward the back, so it did not gall a man raw when he rode, and it left out the binding hip seam entirely, so nothing gathered or pinched. This is not crude work. This is functional design, tuned to the real mechanics of a working body in a cold land, and it took generations of wearing and recutting to arrive at. And then, having built all this brutal practicality, they decorated it. Fine woven braids at the cuffs and the necklines, made by an intricate craft of threading the warp through small square tablets of wood or bone and turning them in sequence to weave complex coloured patterns. Even at the edge of starvation, in the heart of the dark, the human hand reached for beauty. So you can dress a body to survive an hour in the killing cold, the wool that holds heat when wet, the dead air pelt of the shaggy cloak, the sealed and tailored layers. But there is one part of you that all this engineering struggles to protect, one weak point where the whole system threatens to fail, and it is the part of you standing in the snow. It is your feet. For all the genius of the Norse wardrobe, it had a flaw, and the flaw was at the bottom, where the body meets the frozen ground. Footwear was the great vulnerability of the Icelandic winter, and it was a vulnerability that could take your toes, your feet, and finally your life. The shoes themselves were simple. Turn shoes, made of a single piece of leather sewn inside out and then turned right side out, so the seam sat protected within, closed at the ankle, either with a toggle drawn through a slit or a simple seam stitched up the centre. They were light and they were supple, and you can find the two main fashions of them scattered across the Viking world, from the toggle fasten style known from the great trading town of York to the centre-seamed style from Hedeby. But a shoe is only as good as the leather it is cut from, and worked this thin and walked this hard across frozen, broken, abrasive ground, the leather did not last. A pair might survive only a few months before it wore through completely. Think about what that means across a long winter and a whole household. Footwear was not a thing you bought once. It was a constant grinding output of labour, forever being cut and stitched and turned and patched and finally remade from scratch, a quiet tax on time and hide that never stopped being paid. And they had two fatal weaknesses against this winter. The first was that they wore out. The second was worse. Thin leather soaks through almost instantly in wet snow, and wet feet, in a cold like this, are not an inconvenience. They are the open door to frostbite, to flesh freezing, dying, blackening, to the loss of toes and feet, to wounds that turn lethal. A soaked shoe on a long winter task could cost you a part of your body, or all of it. So the Norse fought back on two fronts. First, the sock, and here again the miracle of wool came to the rescue. Thick socks, made not by knitting, which had not yet arrived, but by an older technique of looping the wool with a single needle into a dense, stretchy fabric, were pulled on beneath the shoes. And because they were wool, they did the impossible thing. They kept the foot warm even after the shoe had soaked through and the sock itself was wet through with icy water. A wet wool sock is still a warm sock. That property, more than any other, is what kept Norse feet attached to Norse legs, and second, they waterproofed the leather itself, but here they ran straight into the deforestation again. The standard waterproofing of the Norse world was pine tar, rendered from pine wood, and there was no pine because there were barely any trees at all. So the Icelanders reached, as they reach for so much to the sea. They greased their shoes with rendered seal blubber, working the fat deep into the leather to turn the water away. And not just their shoes, the same seal grease waterproofed their leather outer garments, and it sealed the hulls of the small boats they took out onto that lethal water. The fat of the seal warmed them from the inside as food, lit their lamps, and waterproofed their boots and their boats from the outside. One animal, hunted off the winter ice, did the work that an entire forest did everywhere else. So even the weak point was reinforced, patched, defended by the same relentless ingenuity. The wet, warm wool, the sealed leather, the body kept whole against the frost, one greased shoe at a time. You can now go out into the snow and come back with your feet. But there is a thing out there that no clothing can defend against, because it is not cold and it is not wet, and it does not touch your skin at all. It lasts not for an hour, but for 20 hours of every single day. It presses on the mind instead of the body. And in the deep of an Icelandic winter, it is everywhere and it is almost everything. It is the dark. To understand the Viking winter, you have to understand the sky, because at 64 degrees north, the sky does something that people from gentler latitudes can barely imagine. As the year turns toward its end, the sun does not simply set earlier. It begins to fail altogether. By the depth of midwinter, around the solstice in late December, the sun barely clears the horizon at all. It does not climb into the sky. It skims along the edge of the world. The day, such as it is, lasts 4 hours, 5 at the most. The sun drags itself up late in the morning, around 11 o'clock, and by 3:30 in the afternoon it's gone again. And what little light there is between is not the bright, hard daylight of summer. It is a long, low, slanting twilight, the sun hanging just at the rim of the earth, casting weak shadows that stretch forever, and painting the snow in pale pinks and dull fires, a perpetual dusk. And then, for the other 20 hours of the day, 20 hours, there is darkness. Not for one night, for weeks. For the better part of 2 months, the world you live in is a black, frozen thing, and you live almost the whole of your life by firelight. Walk it through the season and feel it tighten. In November, the light is already short, 6, maybe 7 hours, and the last of the outdoor preparations are rushed to a close as the world contracts indoors. December brings the worst of it, the 4 or 5 hour days around the solstice, 20 hours of artificial light needed to do anything at all, the deepest pit of the dark. January is no better. The days barely lengthen, the cold deepens, and now the dark has been going on long enough that it begins to work on the mind. The long confinement grinding at the spirit when there is no end yet in sight. Only in February does the light truly begin to come back. The days stretching towards 7 and 8 hours, the first easing of the absolute imprisonment. From the closing of November to the opening of February, you live in a near-permanent night. And understand what the light is like in the brief hours you do get it, because it is not the daylight you know. At this latitude, in midwinter, the sun never truly climbs. It rolls along the horizon, low and weak and golden, and even at midday it lifts only a hand's breadth above the edge of the world before sinking back. So the few hours of day feel like one long, drawn-out dawn, sliding straight into one long dusk, with no real noon between them. The shadows stretch out across the snow for impossible distances. The light comes thin and slanting and coloured. Pale pinks, dull oranges, the cold fire of a sun that cannot lift itself off the edge of the world. It is beautiful, in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, and it is brief, and then it is gone, and the long black hours close back over the farm. A person can go days seeing the sun only as a smear of colour low in the south, never feeling its warmth, never standing in its full light. That is the daylight of the Icelandic midwinter, a rumour of the sun and then the dark again. For people in a windowless house of earth, this is not a backdrop. It is the central fact of existence for months on end. The vast majority of your life in this season, eating, working, talking, fearing, hoping, sleeping, happens in the dark, lit only by the hearth in the middle of the floor and by the small flames you can make to push back the edges of it. The sun is not a thing you see. It is a rumour at the edge of the day, and the human animal, built for light, was not made to live this way, which is why the management of the dark, the feeding of the fire and the making of light, became one of the great labours of the winter, as serious as the food and the heat. But there was a problem, and by your lifetime it had become a crisis. To push back the dark, you needed to burn things, and on this island, by the year 980, there was almost nothing left to burn. The hearth must never go out. It is heat layered on top of the cattle's warmth. It is the only way to cook, and across the 20-hour nights it is the one source of real light in the world. Let it die in the deep cold and the house begins slowly to die with it. So the fire must be fed every hour of every day, all winter long, and the feeding of it was, by your time, one of the hardest problems the household faced, because the fuel had run out. It comes back, always, to the trees. When the settlers arrived, the birch woods could have fed the fires for generations, but within a generation or two of heavy clearing, burning and grazing, they had thinned almost to nothing across the settled lowlands, far faster than they could ever return on this cold soil. By 980, the island is in the grip of a slow energy crisis, and wood is the privilege of the wealthy. Only the richest farms hold the rights to the limited driftwood that washes up on the shores, or guard the last few protected scraps of woodland. The experiments with reconstructed houses make the scale of the problem brutally clear. To heat one of these turf halls continuously with wood alone would devour a volume of timber that no ordinary farm could ever supply. Wood heating, for most people, was simply not possible. The fuel did not exist. So the people turned to the ground again, as they had for their walls. The first answer was peat, more, the dense, half-decayed vegetable matter cut from the bogs. In the brief summer, you go down into the bog and you cut the peat in heavy wet slabs, and you stack it and you dry it for weeks in the wind, and then you store it against the winter. Dried peat burns slow and steady and gives real heat, and across most of the island it became the everyday fuel of survival, the thing that fed the fires when the wood was a memory. But peat runs out and peat freezes, and in the worst of the winter even the peat stores could fail you. And so, when there was nothing else, the Norse burned the last fuel the farm could offer, and it tells you everything about how close to the edge they lived. They burned dung, dried sheep dung, gathered through the summer, shaped and stacked and dried hard, and then fed to the fire in the depths of winter, where it smouldered with a slow, low, stubborn, life-saving heat. The collection and drying of it was a foul, endless summer task, and like the worst tasks of this world, it was pushed down onto the lowest hands, the children, the enslaved. And burning it made the already poisonous air of the house worse, adding its own thick, acrid, pungent smoke to the smoke already hanging in the rafters. But it burned. It made heat, and in a house full of people in a frozen dark, heat that smells terrible is still heat, and still life. And the trick never entirely died. Smoking food over burning sheep dung is, to this day, a prized Icelandic technique, used on lamb and fish and even on whiskey, a famine fuel turned, across 1,000 years, into a delicacy. That was the heat. For the light, the Norse made something small and quietly perfect. the lamp they called the cola. It is nothing but a shallow bowl, most often carved from soft soapstone, the same warm rock they cooked with, a little oval hollow that fits in the hand. Into the hollow goes oil, and the oil, of course, comes from the sea, rendered seal fat, or the oil of fish, the same marine fat that fed them and greased their boots. And the wick is the cleverest part of all, because cloth was far too precious to burn. Instead, they used what the land gave free, the dense, absorbent fibres of Arctic moss, or best of all the soft white seed heads of cotton grass, the fluffy tufts that grow across the bogs. Set in the oil, the natural fibres of the cotton grass draw the seal oil up into the flame by capillary action, slowly and steadily, and the lamp burns with a small, calm, remarkably constant light. And because it burns clean marine oil rather than wood or dung, it gives almost no black smoke, only a faint, warm smell of the sea. These little stone lamps were the difference between a useful evening and a wasted one. Clustered along the raised sleeping platforms down beneath the smoke, they made small, steady pools of light in the vast dark of the night, and in those pools the women's hands kept working, the spinning, the weaving, the endless mending of the vadmal that clothed and paid for the whole household went on by lamplight through the 20-hour nights, the soft glow of burning seal oil falling on the turning spindle and the rising cloth, hour after hour, holding off both the cold and the dark and the idleness that the winter could not afford. So the fire is fed and the lamps are lit. The dark is held back by peat and dung and the small flames of the sea. But there is one more thing the dark does, and no fire can fix it, because the same darkness that drove you indoors also locked you in there, with everyone else, for months. And what happens to human beings when you seal 30 or 40 of them into one smoky room and shut the door on the winter is a danger as real as the frost. Picture the house now in the depth of it. January, the dark unbroken, the snow piled to the eaves, the passes shut. And inside that one long low room of earth, packed in together, is the entire world of the farm, the free household, the enslaved, and the animals, breathing in the byre at the end of the hall. On a large farm that can mean 30, 40, even 50 human beings, plus the herd, sealed into a single smoke-filled space in near total darkness for months without relief. Sit with what that actually means. There is no privacy. None. Anywhere. There is no silence and no solitude and no escape. There is the constant press of other bodies, the smell of damp wool and animal dung and unwashed people, and the ever-present wood smoke, all of it trapped under a low turf roof. There is the dark, hour after hour, day after day, with the sun a distant rumour. And there is time, vast, empty, grinding stretches of time, with the outdoor work shut down by the weather and nothing to do but exist together in the close, hot dark. Every habit grates, every small annoyance swells, every old grievance, every slight, every buried resentment is magnified by the confinement until it fills the room. This is a pressure cooker, and the lid is the winter, and it does not lift for months. And remember what kind of people these are. This is a society that settles its disputes through the blood feud, where an insult can become a killing, and a killing can become a war between families that runs for generations. Now take those people, armed, proud, quick to honour, and quicker to offence, and lock them in one room together through the long dark. The danger is obvious. A society like this, confined like this, could tear itself apart from the inside before the spring ever came. The feud did not need an open field. It could ignite in a crowded hall. So the Norse built a defence against it. not of earth or wool, but of words. And this is the most surprising survival tool of them all, because it does not look like survival at all. It looks like entertainment, the storytelling, the recitation of the long, intricate poems, the carving of wood by the fire, the music. These were not idle ways to pass a dull evening. They were engineered pressure valves, deliberately worked to hold the community together when the physical world had shrunk to the size of a single room. A told story binds a room together. It turns a crowd of separate, irritable people into one audience, sharing one thing. The recited poem carries the codes of honour and conduct, reminding everyone in the heat of the confinement of the rules that keep them from each other's throats. The cultural life of the Viking Hall was a machine for keeping the peace, for discharging the pressure of the long dark through art before it could discharge through violence. It is almost certainly where the sagas themselves were born, the great stories that your descendants will finally write down 2 and 3 centuries from now were forged in exactly this, in the firelit, crowded, dangerous winter halls, told and retold across the dark seasons, polished by 100 winters of telling. We hold the written versions loosely, because they came so long after. But the world that made them, the long confinement that demanded them, was real, and you are living in it. And out of the same necessity came the deepest law of this society, the one rule that everyone, free or enslaved, rich or poor, understood to be sacred and unbreakable: hospitality. To take in a traveller, to give a stranger come out of the storm a place by your fire, food in his belly, dry clothes on his back, was not a courtesy. It was an absolute moral duty, and to refuse it was among the gravest dishonours a person could commit. And the reason is simple and brutal. In this winter, to turn someone away from your door was to kill them. There was no other shelter, no inn down the road, no next house within a survivable walk. Your door, or death. So the door had to open. The civilization that could abandon an animal to the snow without a flicker of feeling held the sheltering of a human stranger to be holy, because it had learned, in the hardest possible school, that in a world this lethal, the rule of shelter was the thin line between a society and a graveyard. But that rule of mutual care, that sense that survival was a shared and binding obligation, did not stop at the doorway of a single house. It was written into the law of the whole island. And that law, and the terrible thing it rested upon, is the last piece of the puzzle. Here is something that should not have worked, and did. There is no king in Iceland in 980. No royal court, no standing army, no central government of any kind, no executive power to enforce a single decree. And yet this is not chaos. It is one of the most thoroughly governed societies in the medieval world. It is governed entirely by law, a vast, intricate body of law that, in an age with little writing, was held by memory. The law was kept alive by a single elected office. Each summer, at the great assembly where the whole island gathered, a man stood before the people and spoke the law aloud, from memory, the law speaker. He did not recite the entire code in a single year. The body of law was far too vast for that. Instead, he spoke a portion of it each summer, working through the whole across the 3 years of his term, and reciting the rules of the assembly itself every year without fail, so that the law lived on in the open air and in the memory of the people rather than on any page. The laws themselves, later written down, ran to enormous length, governing everything from killing to marriage to the precise obligations of one neighbour to another. And woven all through them was a single, life-saving idea that in a place this lethal, no household could be allowed to face the winter entirely alone. The heart of that idea was the commune, the district association into which every region was bound, a group of at least 20 landowning farms tied together by law into a single mutual obligation. It was, in plain terms, a compulsory insurance society, designed by people who had watched the winter destroy families and decided to build a wall against it. If a farm in the commune lost its cattle to a sudden disease, or watched its hay rot in an unseasonable rain, the other members were legally bound to come to its aid, to provide relief, resources, the means to survive the season. The risk of catastrophe was not left to fall on whoever was unlucky. It was spread by law across the whole district, and the law went further into the care of the helpless with a precision that is startling. Those who had no family to support them, the destitute, the poor, were not simply left to die. They were quartered out among the farms of the commune, assigned a place to be fed and sheltered, and their placement was rotated from farm to farm in exact proportion to each landowner's assessed wealth, so that the richer you were, the more of the burden you carried. The law even specified the quality of the charity. Paupers were to be given proper, meat-based meals through the autumn and winter, and the law explicitly forbade fobbing them off with mere fish as a cheaper substitute. It was a welfare system, codified down to the contents of the bowl in the year 980 on a frozen rock in the North Atlantic. And to make certain that no one's laziness ever shrank the island's slim margin of survival, the law even punished a landowner who let good farmland sit idle and untended, fining him, in plain words, lest his negligence lessen the food supply of the whole community. It is, by the measure of its age, an astonishingly humane thing, a society with no state at all, building by pure law a safety net that caught the unlucky, fed the poor, and bound every farm to every other against the killing winter. And it stood entirely on the backs of the people it did not protect at all. Because beneath the free farmers, beneath the poor who at least had rights, there was a whole class of human beings who were not, in the eyes of this law, human beings at all. The thralls, the slaves. They came into bondage by 3 roads, captured in the raids overseas and sold through the great slave markets of the Viking world, or driven into it by ruin at home, surrendering their own freedom in a last desperate trade to escape starvation or debt, or simply born into it, the children of the enslaved, slaves from their first breath. And it was onto these people that the real, lethal weight of the winter was pushed. When the blizzard came down and the free household pulled back into the warm safety of the hall, it was the thrall who was sent out into it. The thrall tended the wethers freezing in the open pastures. The thrall broke the ice on the waterhole with numb hands so the cattle could drink. The thrall hauled the heavy loads of hay, cut the frozen turf, did the forestry and the foulest, coldest, most dangerous labour the farm demanded, in the worst of the weather, because the free could afford to spend a slave's life where they could not afford to spend their own. The enslaved women ground the grain at the heavy quern and cooked over the poisonous fire and milked the herd in the cold. And under the law, that same humane, careful law, a crime against a thrall was not a crime against a person. It was damage to property, a wrong done to the slave's owner, prosecuted as you would prosecute the breaking of a tool or the killing of a beast. And so the cruelest arithmetic of all comes back around. Remember the autumn count. The hay weighed against the mouths. If that count came out wrong, if the winter ran longer or harder than the stores could bear and the farm slid toward starvation, the question of who would be fed and who would not was answered by status. The thralls, who were property and not people, would be the first to have their food cut, the first to be allowed to weaken, the first to starve. The iron shackles and slave collars that the archaeologist pulled from the ground are the proof that this was a system held in place when it had to be by force. The brilliant, humane, mutual safety net of Icelandic society was real, and it was woven on a loom of human beings who were counted as livestock and culled like livestock when the math went wrong. And it could go further even than that, into a darkness the sagas only hint at and we cannot fully verify. One old account remembers a district assembly in the grip of a famine winter, debating openly and seriously whether to take the old, the poor and the disabled, the people who consumed food but could no longer produce it, and carry them out into the snow to die, so that the able-bodied might be saved. We do not know if it was ever truly done. The story was written down long after the event it claims to remember, but that the question could be asked at all, debated in a public assembly and remembered for centuries after, tells you the exact shape of the winter these people faced. This was a world that could, at its worst, weigh a human life against a measure of hay, and find the human wanting. So that is what it took. The earth house and the living furnace, the soured milk and the acid-pickled meat, the wind-dried cod and the seal fat, the wet-warm wool and the sealed boot, the peat and the dung, and the small flames of cotton grass, the told story that held the peace and the iron law that bound the farms, and underneath it, the unfree who paid the price that kept everyone else alive. It was not one trick, it was all of them, woven together into a single machine for outlasting the dark. And the machine worked. That is the strangest thing of all. By every measure, this island should have killed the people who chose it, and it did not. They built something that held. But not everyone inside that machine carried the same weight. The free and the enslaved have already shown you that. And there is one more line drawn through this society, as hard and as fixed as any wall. The line between those who lived their winter outside and those who lived it in. There is a word that governs the lives of everyone on this farm, and it is the threshold, the doorway, the physical line between the inside of the house and the world beyond it. And in Norse society that line is not just wood and turf. It is the boundary that divides the whole of human labour in two, and it falls, hard, along the line of who you were born. The men belong to the outside of the threshold. Their world is the herd and the field and the boat, the tools and the hunting, the long rides between farms, and above all the great arena of the assembly, the law, the feuds, the alliances, the public life of a society that settled its fate in the open air. When a man's winter work is done, when the weather drives even him indoors, his domain is finished for the day. The women belong to the inside of the threshold, and do not mistake that for a lesser world, because the inside of the threshold is where survival actually happens. Everything you have learned about how this household lives through the winter, the dairy, the skyr, the cultured butter, the souring of the meat, the spinning and the weaving of the vadmal that clothes the family and serves as its money, the tending of the fire, the cooking of the food, the management of the precious stores. All of it is women's work, controlled and carried out by women inside the house, through the dark. The free farmer's wife runs the indoor economy of the farm the way a captain runs a ship. Without her labour and her knowledge, the inherited skyr culture, the craft of the loom, the management of the larder against the long siege of winter, the household does not merely suffer, it collapses, the estate fails, the people die. The inside of the threshold is the engine room of the whole enterprise, and yet, and this is the bitter heart of it, the world inside the threshold is also where the poison gathers thickest. Go back to that smoke. The fine particles at 100 times the safe level, the carbon monoxide hanging in the unventilated air. Who breathes it longest? The ones who never leave. The women at the loom and the fire, hour after hour, winter after winter, inhaling the price of the heat that keeps everyone alive. The infants in their arms, the old by the hearth. The very people on whom the household most depends are the ones the house most slowly harms. To run the engine room of survival was to live inside the smoke that survival produced. So consider the shape of a free woman's winter. She wakes in the dark and works in the dark, in the smoke, at tasks that never end, and on which every other life in the house depends. She holds in her hands the inherited knowledge that turns milk into a winter's food and fleece into a winter's clothing and currency. She is, in the most literal sense, indispensable. And she breathes the worst of the air, and she carries the children in a place where so many children do not see their 5th year, and her labour is bounded by a threshold she rarely crosses for months at a time. It is not a story of helplessness. It is a story of an enormous, skilled, load-bearing burden, carried in the most dangerous air in the house, by the people the whole farm could least afford to lose. And below even her, inside that same threshold, in the same smoke, working the same heavy quern and the same poisonous fire, stood the enslaved women, doing the hardest of the indoor labour with none of the standing, none of the protection, and first in line to starve if the autumn count came out wrong. The threshold divided men from women, and the deeper line, the line of bondage, cut straight through both. So now you've seen all of it, every wall and every fire, every food and every garment, every law and every burden, and the precise human cost of each. You have seen what it took, and the only honest thing left to ask is the one the whole journey has been building toward. How did anyone choose to live like this? And what did surviving it actually do to them? Stand back at the end of it and look at the whole of this life at once, because the scale of what these people endured deserves to be seen plainly. A child born on this island in 980 enters a world that is actively, structurally trying to kill it. The cold will try, the smoke will try, slowly, across a lifetime of breathing it. The hunger of a bad winter will try, and a bad winter follows a failed harvest the way night follows the short day. The sea will try, and the ice, and the dark, and the fire under the mountains, and weighing on all of it is the knowledge that there is no one coming, no king, no army, no town, no rescue. There is only the farm, the family, the commune, and the machine they have built together out of earth and wool and soured milk and law. The margin between a household and a graveyard is the width of a correct count and a kept fire. And here is the thing that the comfortable centuries that follow will never quite be able to feel. These people did not survive because the world was kind to them. It was not kind. It never pretended to be. They survived because they bent themselves completely and without illusion to the exact shape of its cruelty. They lowered their expectations until survival itself became the whole of their ambition. They did not dream that life would get easier because they had no reason to believe it would. Their hope was a smaller, harder, more precise thing than that. A harvest that did not fail, a winter that did not run long, a count that came out right, a child that woke, one more morning, still breathing. These were the victories. To see 40 years was a triumph. To see a child reach adulthood felt very nearly like a miracle. And those small mercies gathered one at a time against the dark were enough. Enough to get up before the failed sun, enough to feed the fire one more hour, enough to do the whole brutal arithmetic of survival again and again and again. That is the answer to the question everyone asks looking back at a world like this. How did they bear it? They bore it because the alternative to bearing it was to vanish, and because, between the long siege of the dark, there was still the told story by the fire, the warmth of the animals, the inherited spoonful of culture, the braid woven at the cuff for no reason but beauty, the door open to the stranger in the storm. They did not merely endure. Inside the most unforgiving conditions human beings have ever willingly chosen, they made a civilization, with law and art and craft, and an iron code of mutual care laid right alongside an iron code of mutual harm. They were not heroes out of a poem. They were people, doing the math, feeding the fire, and choosing every single dark morning not to disappear, and that should be the end of it. A hard world, a vanished people, a story closed by 1,000 years, except it isn't closed. Because the strangest part of all of this is how much of it is still here. Walk into a supermarket today, anywhere in the world, and open the cooler. There, in a plastic tub with a modern label, is skyr, the same soured, protein-dense cheese, made by the same process, carried by the same kind of living lactic culture that an Icelandic mother once pressed into her daughter's hands on her wedding day. The desperate winter food of the year 980 is now a health product sold across continents. The chemistry the Norse mastered without a word of theory is the chemistry on the side of the carton. Look at the dog working a flock on a green Icelandic hillside in a tourist photograph. It is small and sharp-faced and quick. The living descendant of the very animals that warned the longhouse of intruders and tracked men through the snow and drove the half-wild sheep down from the highlands before the passes closed. The breed survived because the work survived. 1,000 years later, the same dog is still doing a softer version of the same job. Taste the smoked lamb at an Icelandic table, or the smoked fish, or even, improbably, a glass of Icelandic whiskey cured over smoke, and you may be tasting the famine fuel itself. Meat and grain smoked over burning sheep dung, the last desperate fuel of the dark winters, transformed across the centuries from an act of survival into a prized and deliberate flavour. The thing they burned because they had nothing else became a thing they now burn on purpose and pay for. And it goes deeper than food. The Icelandic obsession with wool, the textile heritage, the sweaters known the world over. That is the long shadow of Vadmal, of a society that wove its very money out of fleece and never forgot the craft. The turf houses still standing, preserved and visited, are the same earth battery architecture that held the heat against the killing cold. The fierce Icelandic tradition of hospitality, the sense that a guest is something close to sacred, is the direct inheritance of a law written in blood and snow. The law that to turn a traveller from your door was to commit a kind of murder. And the language itself, the stories, the sagas your descendants finally set down on calfskin, those came out of the crowded winter halls, told and retold against the dark, and they survive today as some of the greatest literature any society has ever produced, born as a way to keep armed and frightened people from killing each other through the long confinement. And the law itself, that strange, kingless system of a code held in one man's memory and recited aloud each summer at the Great Assembly, did not die either. That assembly, the Althing, founded around the year 930, is one of the oldest parliaments in the world, interrupted once, centuries later, under foreign rule, but never forgotten, and revived to carry the same name the Icelandic parliament still bears today, more than 1,000 years on. The windswept plain where the law speaker once stood and spoke the law into the air, where the farms of the whole island gathered to bind themselves together against the winter, is now a place of national pilgrimage. The mutual obligation forged in the threat of starvation became, in the end, a way of governing a country. Look closer, and the survival itself is still walking around. The Icelandic horse, short, tough, sure-footed across broken ground, is the same breed bred on this island for transport and, in the hungry years, for meat, kept so isolated and so pure for 1,000 years that no horse that leaves the island is ever allowed to return. The small, hardy Icelandic sheep that scratch through the winter snow for the fleece that became money is still grazing those same hills, the same ancient lineage, still giving the same wool, and the language those winter halls spoke has barely drifted, preserved by the island's isolation so faithfully that a modern Icelander can pick up the sagas, the stories told in the firelit dark of the year 980, and simply read them, not translated, read, a living thread running unbroken from that smoky hall to this morning. This is the thing the history books so often miss. We are taught to picture the Vikings as the raiders, the long ships breaking out of the fjords, the gold and the violence and the gods, and all of that is real, but it is the surface of the story. Underneath it, holding it up, making it possible at all, is this: a man standing in a field in October, counting cattle against hay, knowing the answer decides who eats in February. A family sleeping low beneath the smoke just to keep breathing, in a house built of the ground itself, kept alive through the dark by the body heat of cattle, eating food soured by bacteria their grandmothers cultured by hand, while outside the night holds for 20 hours at a stretch, and the law of the land decides, coldly and by status, who this winter is permitted to live. They did not conquer the Icelandic winter. No one conquers that winter. What they did was harder and stranger and more human. They built a fragile, brilliant, brutal machine to outlast it. Turf and cattle and fermentation and wool and law and the unfree backs that bore the worst of it. And every single part of that machine had a price that some human being had to pay. That is the real story. Not the heroic one, and not the romantic one. The true one, buried just beneath the surface of the one you were told. That is what it took to survive a winter in Viking Iceland. And that is the real story, underneath the one the history books tell. If you want to keep walking through worlds like this one, lost societies, forgotten lives, history not as a list of kings and battles, but as it was actually lived, in the smoke and the dark and the cold, then subscribe to Worlds Before Us. And before you go, tell me in the comments, if you had stood in that field in the failing October light, with the hay on one side and the hungry mouths on the other, could you have done the math and lived to see the spring? Because the next world we rebuild may be colder still,